Good afternoon. We are back. I know you all have missed us. We've missed you. We hope you had a great August and September. We are bringing a very unique webinar to you today. This is not traditional senior living as you have seen in the past. We are going to explore intergenerational living, and we're going to explain what that is and how that's different from what you may typically think of when you think of senior living. I'd like to first introduce my panelists. We have returning with us Jane Rohde, who is part of our ALC, and Linda Kafka, who has been with us previously. She comes to us with a Canadian perspective, which we appreciate. And new to our panel is Christine Foster. And she is steeped in senior living and is with 823 Interior Design. With that, we are going to start. I would like to encourage everyone who has joined us, if you have questions, please do just register online and send us the question. We'll answer them in the order that they are received, and we will not hold them until the end. So if you have a question during this webinar, please do just write it and we will answer it. Okay, so we're going to start by asking Jane to explain the difference between multi-generational versus intergenerational housing and living. Jane.
Thank you, Phoebe. Thank you so much. So hello, everybody. Good to be back. It's fun to do these because we love talking with each other as a dialogue and a conversation. So when we look at intergenerational living, it's something that brings people together that are different ages, which is similar to multi-generational, but it is the opportunity to actually provide access to services and amenities. And so it's intentional. So it may be intentional in terms of the populations that are served, in terms of, for example, it could be an older adult, it could be the primary backbone of a residence in a multifamily residence, but the vulnerable population may be a young woman aging out of foster care with one child, for example. So it's an intentional community that's set up to provide support and provide a bit of a wraparound. There's always a balance between doing normal neighboring and getting to know people and some staff influence. So there has to be a balance of it, because you want those relationships to become normalized, but you also want to make sure that they're integrated in a way that it has meaning. So it's purposeful, it's meaningful, it's very intentional. Could be like your chosen family. Multi-generational is much more of various ages, but you're creating a neighborhood that allows for it. So you've heard the term NORC, naturally occurring retirement community. That kind of happens because people are all living and they happen to age out about the same time. So multi-generation is basically living with others of different ages, but the relationships just develop naturally, and it's not done as an intentional type of process, if you will.
Well, I appreciate that, because I think there's confusion about what's the difference. They're two words kind of similar, and it's good to know how they differentiate. Linda, tell us, is intergenerational living growing in popularity in Canada as well?
You know what we're seeing up here in the Canadian market actually is the growth of the multi-generational right now. But that's not to say that intergenerational isn't happening, and I'll explain. You know, we all know that you know, multi-generational living was really popular in the 1940s and onward, and it was really declining in the Canadian market by the 70s. And you know, and we couldn't wait to leave our homes, leave our parents, and get out there and do our own. And so because of not just COVID and looking to, to reconnect with families and to have our families closer to us and to share resources, especially real estate, we're seeing the rise of multi-generational happening. But what's really interesting is that a lot of these bedroom communities that kind of, you went to retire in the bedroom communities, what we're seeing is a lot more intergenerational, or maybe perhaps organically starting to happen, even though it is an intentional concept or an intentional way of living. It's starting to take root in I would think more of the outerlying bedroom communities, where what we're seeing is that, the younger generation is coming in because they want that better quality of life. They can now work from home remotely. They don't have to show up at an office. They're still strapped with resources, but they also, see the value of connecting with elderly people in their community, whether it's, relationships, learning, shared resources, childcare, whatever. So we're seeing that starting to happen, and as a result, smaller towns are starting to create spaces that are, more communal, bringing people together. So that's what I'm starting to see up here in specifically Ontario. That's where I'm based. But yeah, it is on the growth. On the growth. The challenge is that there's such a small differences between understanding what multi-generational is and intergenerational. And I think there is confusion happening on that. So I think what's really important is a lot of us that either listening today or our panelists and others need to really help share the knowledge and the differences of them. And I think the movement is going to shift towards the intergenerational, and when it happens, it's going to go big because it's got such great value associated to it, huge values.
And Jane, that's what's happening here, right? We're already making that shift. And I think, so tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, you're right. And it happens in different ways. And so I like to think of myself as the anti-developer, because with Live Together, it's basically not replicating exactly the same thing in the exact same way that isolate elders or isolate children or isolate whatever population that you're working with. So the US has sort of a unique positioning right now, because multifamily, what we've found in our research is about 25% of multifamily housing is really toward the boomer. And so boomers are moving into multifamily, and we already have the millennials moving in and some families moving in. So in a sense, our multifamily buildings are just that. They've become multi-generational by default, right? So now if you want to turn that into intergenerational, you would add the appropriate services and amenities, the access, and a little bit more integration. And when you do that, it becomes an intentional community. So we've had, as a result of the pandemic, it's been interesting because there's a lot of things that need to change long-term care, no doubt, as a result of the pandemic, as we've all seen. However, the multi-generational or the multifamily side is interesting to me, because they used to have certain retail that they would definitely put into the lower level of a mixed use building. Well, that started shifting, and then retail started changing, and then restaurants aren't quite there. And what are we going to do with it? So developers were willing to talk to me, and architecture firms were willing to talk to me, who really work in the multifamily side. So as a result of that, we've started seeing some shifting in terms of what could go there. So now, what if you actually made sure that you were supplying the grocery store or an outpatient rehab center or a home health care agency or extended care right within your multifamily, so then you start to see it in a different way. So I think people will start calling it all different kinds of things, honestly, because it's foreign in a sense, but it's the most natural thing there is, right? Is living with other people of different ages. And so when we look at a project that way for Live Together, we've been looking at it from the grassroots perspective. So if you're in a community and maybe you don't need all those components, or maybe you need some of those components, or maybe you already have, 2, 3, 4 generations living in an area, but you don't have the access part. So if you could start doing the access part to the community services and the amenities and understand what they need. Every community doesn't need the same thing. Meridian, Mississippi is going to be completely different than looking at Detroit, or Detroit's different than Cumberland, Maryland, which are some of the sites that we've been looking at. And so as a result, you start to meet those needs, and at the same time, you're fostering the intergenerational intervention. It really becomes almost like an intervention itself, an intervention in a good way, because that terminology isn't always as favorable, but it's meant from a very positive perspective.
You mentioned intention, and Christine, you have some very specific definitions around the term that include inclusive environments. And I'd love for you to explore that for folks so that we better understand the intentional element and also take into account inclusivity.
Sure. I want to start by saying that I am also in the process of learning and defining all of these terms, and I feel humbled and honored to be with these other industry professionals. I think I recently had it explained to me that, and what draws me to the live together model is the purposeful nature of it. I feel that those types of intergenerational models sort of deal with additional issues within our culture. And as Jane mentioned, take a look at it from a perspective of that unique community, and sort of says what are the needs and what are the problems and the issues that we need to solve in that community. It's very purposeful. And although an intergenerational community can be like, as you can see in the slide, the pocket neighborhoods, this is an example of multi-generational, in which there's pocket neighborhoods and the community itself, the entire.
I'm going to stop you right there. Can you define for our audience pocket neighborhoods, please?
Sure, those are just small groups of homes that are situated in such a way that they're small. Oftentimes they're like 600 to 800 square feet, and they're situated in such a way that they're on a larger campus typically, but they're in small neighborhoods in which it helps to develop and form those natural relationships. And multi-generational communities are inclusive, so they allow for different abilities, and they're accessible to all. But that doesn't mean that there was purpose in terms of putting two populations there that you distinctly wanted to interact with one another. It just means that it's accessible. And then this is more of a natural relationships form on these types of campuses. Does that answer the question?
I think it does. But we don't always have multi-generational communities in a large campus environment, correct?
That's correct. The intergenerational, and feel free to correct me, Jane or Linda, the intergenerational models tend to be in smaller, the size of them are typically a little bit on smaller campuses, and suit, my understanding was, two populations that were distinctly put together to assist one another.
And then you can expand that too, because we find that we do it kind of in a percentage model. Like this is Bastion. It's for wounded warriors is the vulnerable population, but then there's also families, and then there's retired, well, both civilians, but most of them are retired military. So I love the fact that it gave purpose to the retired military as well. So in a sense, it can have well, look at it this way. Any population can be vulnerable at any point in time, right? So a student, when they first go to school, is pretty vulnerable, right? When they go away to college. So in a sense, they're a vulnerable population at a period of time. Then they get their wings and they get, a little cocky, and then they go on from there. But it's basically looking at it from two populations that you're intentionally putting together, but then usually a third in terms of supportive families. And we've seen this in Generations of Hope is where I learned that. And then there was a project that we did with young folks that were aging out of foster care with seniors. And then you realize that every population is not the same too. So that senior population, which we had a volunteer clause that they had to fill out when they moved in as part of their agreement, their tenant agreement. Well, part of that was that they were also still working part-time. And so we hadn't taken that into consideration. We'd given them a whole boatload of volunteer hours that they had to fulfill. So we had to back off on that a little bit. But the note of success was there was a note on the board when I went to the opening, and it said, hey, if you need help babysitting, give me a call, or better yet, just knock on my door and I live in room 105. Now that's when we know that we're having engagement, that's an interventional type of engagement or intentional type of engagement. So yes, to Christine's point, it's usually two populations that you're kind of focusing on, but then we usually like to add in what we call supportive families. And that gives you a variety, because that's kind of how we normally would live, right? We would have young people, we'd have older people, you could have students, all of those different pieces and parts.
And if I can add to that, as you asked the question with regards to the inclusive environments, typically we'd be looking at accessible spaces for people with disabilities. We know as people age that they need, they may, depending if they have a progressive condition or they might be challenged with their sight and their hearing and their mobility, and then there's issues to deal with when it comes to dementia. But when we talk about inclusive environments, we look at everybody. We look at the young people, the youngest. We look at right from a woman that's pregnant to small children, but also we don't neglect people that come into those environments, like the PSWs and the occupational therapists that have to work, or the caregivers. And so the idea of inclusive environments is not looking at one specific progressive condition, or looking at somebody that has, is in a wheelchair and we need ramps. It's really looking at the whole population, and how do we create environments that really adapt to us as our needs change, and what do we need to put into place. So it might be, through technology use. It might be through the way we've constructed or designed even outdoor landscaping, so that we're not having to add in ways for people to access their spaces and so on. So there's so many areas that we can touch on when we talk about inclusive environments. And that's a very, I think, important component of bringing people together intentionally, is that their space needs to adapt to them versus the other way around.
And you're also looking at it from the people who are involved in a community from an inclusivity perspective. Is we don't want them to be, it's a unique person, right? This idea of doing demographic planning makes me crazy. It's like saying that everybody who has dementia has the exact same diagnosis. And you're like, no, if you have 50 people with dementia, they have 50 different diagnoses, and they're all at different stages, and they have different good days and bad days. So when you start to look at that, exactly what Linda was saying is that you're also looking at it from a unique perspective. We're not taking a whole demographic and just saying they are X as a diagnosis. You're looking at them as a human. And evaluating what those human needs are. And things do change over time. When Hope Meadows first started, it was to bring kids from foster care into adoption. What they didn't plan for is they added elders, but they never thought about the elders aging out, right? Because that wasn't the initial intention. So later on, they were like, uh-oh. So then they started something called a Hope House, and the Hope House was where folks could live, because it was on an old military base, so it had those split levels, with the stairs. So they did some things that were on one level, and people could start to share. And they did things like wider door openings that were double doors that would open to a bedroom, for example, so that you could use it as a shared living space, as well as if someone needed a nursing home bed at some point in their life. So this idea of that flexibility and adaptability to what the condition is really important.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in knowing, these are all families, and it's inclusive, but it doesn't have to be your family, right? You can choose a family that's maybe not your own, which many people might want to do anyway. I love my family, but
I love my family at a hand's distance.
Choose a family.
So this is kind of funny. We were talking about voting people off the island, right? So when we were talking about what happens when you bring in a bunch of adults who don't really know each other, and they're forced to live together, and it's like, well, forcing isn't really the idea, but a lot of times you may end up with folks living in a community, or in a community setting, even if it's small. So if you had 8 to 10 people living in a home and they were unrelated, we actually had one woman, she voted him out of the table, basically off the island, because he wasn't kind, he wasn't behaving. And so as a result of that, he had to come back and apologize and ask to rejoin the group. So you can have house rules, right? But you also choose carefully, because like, if your group of friends, I can think of a few friends, it's like, yeah, that's probably not compatible. So the other way is to look at it from an affinity perspective, right? So some of the things like Hojwick and others, they've looked at it from a music, everyone has music in common. So if we all want to do the Rolling Stones, Phoebe, we would all live in your house. So like thinking through what affinities would make sense. And so you're going to have choice. And I think that's a big part of it too, is because if you can choose who you live with and what the process is, and have services come to you instead of you moving through service, it takes a lot of the scary out of it for older adults particularly.
Well, let's talk about the benefits of this intergenerational living. And I'm interested also in how you would qualify residents, because there's got to be, beyond finding music and things that people spark to, there's got to be other qualifying pieces to it. What does that look like?
Well, you have to be careful because of fair housing. So if you want certain folks to move in, like there's it's going to be a wonderful project. There's over 500 young people with autism in one of the counties that's adjacent to where I live. And they were only able to get 19 set aside apartments. You know, people are like, oh, that's just a drop in the bucket. Why aren't there more? Well, that was all that they could manage to get within a, you know, an affordable community.
Right.
But they were able to do a set aside. So sometimes you can do a set aside to allow for that. But you also can structure your agreement. We try to get people to volunteer, that they know that they're moving into something that they're expected to volunteer and they have a certain commitment. So we did a presentation last week, and one of my colleagues presented a village that's up in Needham, Massachusetts. And it's on a campus, on a university campus. And so the only way they could build on there, because it was a land grant, was to allow for them to take 400 credit hours a year. And everyone said, no, it'll never work. And it actually became one of the most popular, it's called the Sal Village, one of the most popular things. They have a waiting list, everything works. It's very much an intergenerational approach. And so they were able to make that work. So you can put in requirements and let people know why you're doing it. You can also talk with, if you're doing child welfare, you could do child welfare services, and you can say Department of Aging. You can also talk to them and kind of court the people that you think would be appropriate. Like they can recommend people. They don't necessarily have to move in, but you can recommend people. But you do have to be very careful with fair housing, and you have to make sure that you're you have a very tight agreement in terms of your leasing agreement.
Linda, do you have those same concerns in Canada?
You know what, we're not quite that far. Now, firstly, we don't have Fair Housing Act here. And I can't even think of, I mean, human rights. I think that's what we'd fall under, but not the Fair Housing Act. So a little bit different in that, you know, we haven't advanced that far. I just heard today from an individual in Quebec, in Gatineau, Quebec, where they're actually doing this in one of the cities, and it's a whole community, it's a whole neighborhood that they are really moving towards intergenerational and adding these services in. But it's an existing community, and there's actually surprisingly code. If you want to renovate your home in this small community, you have to. There's rules and regulations. And I don't mean from the building code side. I mean from the actual. I don't mean from the building code side. I mean from the actual town itself, where you have to have a porch, and that's part of the requirement if you're doing any kind of renovations to the home. So we don't have the same. It's coming here. It hasn't. It's not as what we currently have in the States, but you know, it'll be interesting to see how it develops out. And I'd like to think that, you know, if you did end up finding yourself in an intergenerational community and you were finding it difficult and you weren't, you know, liking the rules, even though you knew what they were when they came in, you know, you most likely will say this isn't for me and end up leaving. It's, you know, you might not know until you actually get into the community to determine whether or not it's the right fit for you. So it's not a one size fits all, but you know, I think that we will kind of massage it and find ways to make it work for the individuals that live there.
And it's kind of like the introvert versus the extrovert conversation too, right? So somebody in a continuing care retirement community, that might be a perfect model for them. It only serves such a small percentage of our population, but if they're really extroverted, it might be perfect. But the introverted person might be like, this is like total hell for me. You know, like I want to have more choice, and I need quieter times and quieter spaces and more opportunities to observe instead of integrate. And I think that intergenerational can give you that opportunity, because I was in Korea one time. They have a continuing care retirement community, and they had a child daycare that was part of it as part of the community center. And you could look down off of the bridge, and it was like, oh, this is cool, because you can observe, you can watch the kids and you can watch them do what they're doing, or you can volunteer and you can actually interact with the kids, or you can actually be like more full-time with it and actually be really integrated into the child care center. And I thought that was really a good way to look at it, because I've worked with residents in different cities who've raised different generations of kids, and they're like, I don't need to be raising any more kids. So in their perspective, that wouldn't necessarily be something that they want. So I think you're right. I think it's very personal in terms of it, and it's not for everybody, you know, and I think people do recognize it once they would see your move. I'm always interested when I meet with Rotary groups, because they're usually older adults that would be in that community service side, and they'll be like, hey, how come we haven't done something like this before? because they're like, I'd like to make some cookies with that kid or whatever, like just in terms of their own isolation and socialization needs. I think it was kind of interesting to see.
I think
And-
also
But then there's a flip side of it, right? There's a flip side of it because, Christine, there are challenges, right? With having youth residing adjacent to or within a home with elders. So how do you manage those challenges? Because it's not all about elderly looking and seeing little kids that are cute and they want to play with. Sometimes it's, older kids, maybe teenagers. So how does that get managed?
That's true. I know that I've been working in my community, just trying to start the process to get folks to give some advocacy and awareness to some of these new intergenerational models. And I started with an aging in place group to try to create demand. And that was one of their first concerns was security, the issue of security. When I mentioned underserved youth living on the same campus, that was their first reaction was security. And I think that goes both ways, that how would the youth feel? That's one challenge I'm having in my community right now is in which demographic to create the demand for these models, because they both uniquely have their own concerns, and it's difficult to get everyone around the same table because they don't really understand what, if I go to a youth group, such as an AIM or a group that supports youth specifically, they say you're trying to do this model with senior living, and they don't know what role they play in that. And it's the education at a higher level to even create the demand. And sometimes it feels as if it's a real challenge to do that. So there are concerns. And I think it's just more educating and creating more awareness and giving examples of models that have been successful that we need to.
And it's funny too, because when that's always the first question I get too, is both sides think that the other one is like an unsafe population. I think it's really funny. Well, what if the seniors bother my children? And I'm like, really? Oh my goodness. It's almost as though if you went back to like just normal life of having neighbors, right? And you almost got to bring them back down to that, because I think regulations have really choked the opportunity for innovation. And as much as you know, Phoebe, I've worked in regulation for 15 years, rewriting books and rewriting regulations across everywhere for facility guidelines. And so it's so frustrating to see that people are still limiting things, and it's because they haven't talked to each other before. So it's a silo process. I had a conversation with about staffing yesterday. We were talking about social work, PT, OT, and nursing. And she goes, even silos were taught that way in silos. We're not taught to work together as a team. We're not taught. So that's what we've been trying to do with the Live Together Institute, is trying to break down some of those barriers, because if we don't get the staffing to also think that way, it'll be very hard to get other folks to think that way. And so it really is a shift paradigm in thinking about how we live and how treating people as an individual person to person, and getting away from, no, regulations won't let you do that. Well, let's figure out how regulations could let us do that, and I found that some people can be really cooperative because they all know that it has to change, because we need more models and we need things that hit the affordable point. We need to, help different groups. We have more vulnerable population than we ever had before. We have all the mental health issues that we have. So it's just gotten worse. And the pandemic has probably made that more visible to a bigger group, right? So hopefully that bigger group will now go, oh, there's alternatives. We can try something different.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think about all of these people who, we both know people who have, 4 generations living in their house, but that's very different than an intentional community, a place where somebody maybe doesn't have a family that 4 generations can cohabitate, right? And so it's a new thinking. It is going to require education. How many intergenerational communities really exist in the US even today?
I can think of at least a dozen or more. So they are there. There's some that are been around for a long time too. Like Generations of Hope's it's like over 25 years old. Treehouse out of Massachusetts. The Bridge Meadows has 2 communities out on the Pacific Northwest. I think they're in the Oregon area and Seattle area. There are different pieces and parts, and it also, the other reason is that you don't always hear about them all together I think is because they serve different populations. Right. So you might have one group that's working on women getting out of prison. That's a very hard population, right? Versus an underserved youth or a baby or kindred care. Kindred care is when you're, say, a grandparent taking care of a grandchild. And that's very common. That's an escalating issue, particularly with the opiate epidemic. We've seen an increase in that. We've seen an increase in kids being trafficked because of the opiate epidemic. So it's all these like kind of the darker side of society that wants to give solutions to some of that. And nursing homes the same way. I mean, there's not a human I can think of right now that would say, oh, I want to go move to a nursing home. Right.
Yeah, and I just want to add to this. Several years ago, we had a conversation around this with same-sex couples, and and the fact that they don't have, if they haven't adopted children, they may not have children in their lives. So if their significant other is gone, who's looking after them, and how are they going to, cope with a lot of those needs that we find as we start to age? But it's interesting because I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with a young 29-year-old, and she said her interest in wanting to connect with seniors is that she didn't have, as a first-generation Canadian, she didn't have grandparents. Her grandparents had passed away, and they were from the Philippines. And so for her, having that connection to sit there and actually knit with an elderly, woman that knew how to knit and teach her some things. And so, when I did bring them together, the warning I had to give her was the fact that the individual I'm teaming you up with has no filter, and she can come across quite aggressive and abusive, but she's got a heart of gold. So I think what Jane said, it's the education, and I think we're going to find ourselves educating the different generations that will come together in an intergenerational community about the differences between the different generations and helping them both understand each other. And that's going to be part of that education process, because you have assumptions.
Yeah.
Right?
And the culture part too, right? So you just brought up you hit another point there too. It's about the understanding of culture. Like if you have a care worker who's from Jamaica, who's Catholic, and she's taking care of an Orthodox Jewish woman who keeps kosher, trying to explain that in a way that makes sense. It has to be looking at the sensitivities of it. So that's another reason to we have to understand the diagnosis, because that's why someone needs extended care. But it really is like 10% of the person, right? That other 90% is all those other things that make up a person's life. And so if we can think through those things, and then instead of doing a health record, I like to think of it as a life record, so you're documenting. And we think that wraparound service and having someone to go ask different questions is a big part of just elevating the care that people are receiving. So they're getting the care they need specifically, instead of getting it like an unmanaged way of just kind of going through and whether it's contraindicating medications or whatever it might be. There's ways to avoid that and that could be for anybody. That's not, people think that's an elder thing, and it's like, not necessarily, it's an everybody thing. Yeah. So looking at things more broadly and identifying it that way, and then educating around it, I think you guys are right. I think that's exactly the direction that needs to happen.
Well, we've got a slide up right now about Live Together, and I think that might be a really great place to kind of talk about Live Together, which I know is your baby, Jane, and talk about how it's considered a senior living community and a multi-living community or multi-housing community, and what makes it both.
So what we were going toward is that I have a good friend. He's been on some of your webinars before, Steve Lindsay, and he and I love brainstorming with him. He's such a creative dude, and we had this opportunity to talk about why aren't we to a tipping point for person-centered care? That's where the conversation started. And that coupled with watching, we do operational programming for a lot of our clients, and then we would watch it get torn apart and not honored as it was being designed. We thought, hey, there's got to be a better way to do this. So we talked about workforce development as one of the pieces. So we were like, so what if the workforce development, he goes, people come to our community all the time looking for training and education around person-centered care. We're not set up as an institute. We're not set up for training. People can shadow people, but that's all we got. So I said, well, what if we intentionally started out with an institute that started to break down some of the silos and start talking about it? So the workforce development component is for people who are providers who want to shift and change. It's for frontline workers that we would hire within a live together community directly. It could be anyone who wants to learn more about what person-centered care means. And so the Institute is starting to be put together with different courses and coursework. And that way we thought that would help with the tipping point in the educational component that we were talking about just now, but also this opportunity that aging can be a career and it can be a rewarding, purposeful career. Because part of the problem is people think, old people, I don't want to work in aging. They have no idea how beautiful and wonderful and rewarding it really can be. And people are starting to ratchet up the cost level. We're starting to see, taking care of some of those issues in terms of having benefits and having a reasonable hourly wage, things like that. So that's part of it. And then the other part is doing demonstration projects where we bring generations together. So we've been working on with a very creative developer out of Detroit to try to see where we fall. And we start with the engagement center. So part of the components are evaluating, here's a list of components that we've kind of developed over time. Some are virtual, like the Village to Village Network. Others are things like putting in outpatient therapy in terms of rehab, and then adding home health care, but actually running those as live together, and then taking the profits from that and putting it back in to have a wraparound process for care and amenities and access to service. So we believe in the triad. This has become my sacred thing here now: the nursing, the social work, and the PTOT. Right? If we can put the three of them together and we can create a triad within a multifamily building, then we actually have all the generations. You actually have the care and support you need, and we can actually have one or two of them run one of those components, which we think we can do. This is a great segue into opportunities for extended care. So in Detroit, we've actually got the health department to agree to allow us to do an apartment as a long-term care household, right? So it's all within the multifamily, right? Except it's a larger apartment because it has more people in it, but we can add a student and we can add an independent living resident who would like to live there in that same apartment. So they call it adult foster care, and it has a reimbursement stream. So that's why we're particularly interested in with it, because most states don't have any kind of reimbursement stream for any kind of assisted living. But I'll let Christine talk to the various models though, because the small house is really that's where the rubber meets the road. And that's what we were trying to get to in a tipping point was, if we're going to do extended care being skilled or assisted or whatever higher level care you need, that it should be in a smaller environment and it should feel like home. And that's really what the greenhouse is about. So I'll hand it to Christine to talk a little bit about that.
Perfect.
I love the idea that the extended care piece, the small house model, can be integrated into that larger intergenerational campus. We're exploring this in my small community in upstate New York right now as an option. And one piece of the small house model that I really think that the folks in my community are drawn to is the idea of having a purpose and having a small group of folks that they can share dinner with, they can help to prepare the meals. That's sort of the part of the operations of the small house model, as they work together. They have purpose each day. And I think a good point to make too, as well, is we've sort of gone from, in recent years, a lot of the senior living models were sort of a hospitality approach to senior living, in which it became sort of almost like a hotel situation, but we were still segregating. We were still segregating this social capital that we have in our elders and the wisdom that they can share. We were still sort of putting them in their own area. And what Live Together does, and some of these small house models, is allows for different types of relationships to form that would form in your typical daily life as you've gone through life, instead of being segregated by age as you age. So I think that these intergenerational models really serve that to give the elders a purpose. And I know the folks in my community are drawn towards that.
And I
So
think that
being familiar with small house now, thanks to one of our webinars and Steve Lindsay, would it be fair to say that if you combine an intergenerational model and a small house, that's what we've got then going forward?
well, we would try to do that, but it depends, right? So I think that's when we get to, I try not to be formulaic with this. So I'll give Cumberland as an example. So Cumberland has this great historic section of the city, right? It already has buildings that can be renovated. It has all these different pieces and parts.
Right.
So for them, they don't really need extended care. They already have some assisted living and they have some other things kind of meets the demographic. There's definitely gaps. Don't get me wrong. There's gaps in terms of service and that kind of thing. But more of their service is for the independent living folks who are older. Like, for example, there was a gentleman who was living in his house. He had to go to the emergency room. He left the emergency room at midnight and no one verified that he had a ride home. And the taxi service in Little City of Cumberland stops at midnight. So he didn't have a way home. So we started talking about doing the village to village network and creating a care manager, which would most likely be a social worker, that would actually be the glue that you'd pay a small membership fee, and they would then plan things like that for you. Or if you got stuck, they would have someone to call and that person can help get what you need put together. And so it could be transportation to an appointment. It could be access to a specialist. It could be a food service delivery that you need, for dinner. It could be any different types of things, depending on what you were doing. But for them, it's more of the virtual piece that's important. And then eventually some of those older buildings, a couple of old department stores, that they really have amazing opportunity, but it might be apartments with home health care. Not necessarily a small house extended care. So it depends, I guess, is the question. But yes, I think that that's how we shift the workforce development understanding and the education toward a different model thought process. And it's not a double loaded corridor stinky nursing home. It's oh my gosh, it's like a building like any of us would live in.
Because nobody wants to live in a nursing home, especially
wants to live in a nursing home, especially now.
I have a question from David Eilers, who's asking Christine to provide any updates on Dr. Bill Thomas's tiny home projects around the country.
I know that his first model was the Minka. I followed that for quite some time. And then Calamos is his newest model. And that's out west. It doesn't seem to be a lot of that going on the East Coast yet. But again, that's multi-generational. And I could send, if he wants to put in the chat, I could send additional information specific to what I know, what I've been following on that model.
Okay, great. That sounds good. I'm going to take this back to design, which is kind of where we started a long time ago. And we're going to go to what the intergenerational home looks like from a design perspective. And we're going to discuss biophilia here. So Linda, take us through this gorgeous kitchen.
That's a whole session on its own. I hope you'll do it down the road. But you know what? So let me start before I get into the biophilia, because that is something that's really important. And we're seeing that science, the convergence of science and design, and why that actually really contributes to wellness. I just want to have a quick kind of just a few pointers on the design itself. So when we're looking at intentional or intergenerational or even multi-generational, knowing that you've got there is no perfect person, there is no perfect height or weight or whatever. Everybody is different sizes, different statures, different abilities, and so the design has to encompass a greater amount of the population, and that's why, or that live within those facilities, and that's why so many of us turn to universal design and the principles. But when we talk about people with different preconditions or mobility or disabilities, we have to look beyond just the principles. And so what you're looking at is how do we address access into the space, into these buildings. What are we looking for in terms of where the, where bedrooms are in relation to full accessible bathrooms, to communal areas, and so on. And so a lot of the principles, or what you're looking at in these intergenerational homes, are going to be very much what we would look at in aging in place, if that's easy. And that's been around for over 25 years. But you're looking at ways to really make those environments not just safe and secure, but comfortable. And so if I move towards the wellness and the rise in wellness, and I'm AP well AP certified, meaning I have a greater understanding through my training on what it means to create a well environment. We're looking at various elements. So from under the umbrella of biophilia, which is what that is it's our human. We weren't born in buildings. We were born into nature. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, we were born into it, and that is in our DNA, to have that connection to nature. And so some of the important things that we're going to need within our homes or our intergenerational spaces is that connection to nature, and that can come in different forms. It's not just the greenery, it's that view out into nature. It's our lighting. So in this particular picture here, I'm looking at the wood grain. It could be real or mimicked, but wood grain alone has the science behind this, and the research in biophilia demonstrates that it actually reduces your heart and your stress levels and your heart rate by 6%. And so you're looking at different elements that are going to contribute to a better environment. So biophilia incorporates thermal. It incorporates ventilation. Just if you think about elements from nature, that's what we're bringing into our spaces. And if we can't actually bring them in, we're mimicking them. And so, how do we feel within those spaces? That's what it's going to come down to at the end of the day, because what we want to do is we want to create an environment that keeps us calm and relaxed and spiking our serotonin and not our cortisol, which is your fight, flight, freeze. In that environment, those environments are not healthy. So it's really going to be important for a lot of the people that are working in the design process and specifying products to look at how can we incorporate biophilia into our environments. And if you want more information on this, you just have to look to the commercial and the workplace environment. So look at the spheres in Seattle. Look what Apple is doing. Look what Etsy does in their place in New York, and how they look to really bring biophilia and wellness into their spaces for their employees, not only to reduce absenteeism and increase productivity, but create a better environment for them mentally and physically. And not hotels, but hotels are definitely doing it. But in the hospital industry, there is no better example of biophilia than what you have at the hotel in Singapore. And I'm going to probably pronounce it wrong. Let me see if I can pronounce it correctly. It's the Singapore's Khoo Teck Puat Hospital. It's one of the most best examples of biophilic design, and it really explicitly ties to the goal of human wellness, human health, and well-being. And that's what we're going to start to see more and more of in these environments, because we're bringing people together. We want them to be active and healthy, and so it's, what are we contributing? We're looking at the indoor air quality, all of those elements that are going to create not just a space that you can easily maneuver through or connect with other people, but how do those environments actually help us to remain healthy within those spaces? So that is, we're going to see more and more conversations around that. And the term biophilia has really only been around for 10 years plus. It's not an old term. It's a fairly new one. But that whole convergence of science and design and how our environments impact our well-being, that's what we're moving towards.
There's a really good resource too that people might not know of, because I didn't know about it until I sit on the Green Building Advisory Committee for GSA, for the General Services Administration. And there's a tool called SF tool. It's literally sftool.gov. And it has, we had done a crosswalk with them on Well, LEED, Green Globes, Fitwell, to look at what health and wellness federal principles, the guiding principles, what were addressed in the different types of systems, the building certification systems. But they have some great research on not only biophilia, but a lot of work from Rensselaer, from Dr. Figueroa on circadian systems. And there's just some really, really good, it's so rich and so deep. And I had no idea how much was in there in the tool in terms of what it can be in terms of resources. So if people are interested in biophilia as well, I would recommend that as a good resource for them.
Yeah, Terrapin Green has some great ones out. If you go to, well building standards, but biophilia encompasses light, air, like all those natural elements, all the natural elements. And then we talk about fractal patterns and, and how that actually impacts us. And so, if you're not familiar with biophilia and you are in the design world, or you're going to be involved in a project, it's imperative that you start to look at those elements. Like I said earlier, we were not born in buildings, we were born in nature. Nature has no right angles. So, we feel our best and our most comfortable in a natural environment. And if you ask most people, where's your favorite place? Often, outside of your, some people say their living room or something like that. But most people will honestly say, I love the beach. I love that walk through the forest. I love, being out in the garden. And there's a lot that it's that human connection that we crave. And it was basically taken away from us during the Industrial Revolution. And now it's starting to come back in a really important way for us.
We're seeing outside spaces included, which is great because of the pandemic. We're now seeing outdoor spaces as actual planned areas and rooms and not the leftover courtyard. So that makes me very happy too that we're seeing that. I'm sorry, Phoebe.
Both Linda and Jane, you've both identified sources. You had SF, what was the rest of it?
sftool.gov. Yeah, I'll put it in the chat.
Yes, if you could put that on the chat, that would be great because we had a question about that. And also, Linda, if you can put any other tool, not tool, but any other resource up on the chat, that would be terrific because we're getting a lot of questions about that. We have time for maybe one more question. So we're going to stay on design. And Christine, I want to talk about design and multi-generational living and how we address various socioeconomic backgrounds and how does that change the way intentional multi-generational spaces look and feel?
So this is something that I'm dealing with in my community currently. One way I am going about attempting to make sure that we do include all socioeconomic backgrounds is to develop a tool for measurements so we can get a baseline of what the desires and the needs are of our elder population. And I'm going to various groups for that. One of my hopes is that in the industry, as we move forward with some of these intergenerational models, is that we will be able to further develop tools in order to measure and establish a baseline. I know a challenge that I'm having in my community right now is I developed a survey, made sure that the group was willing to do it on the computer electronically, and I just developed a Survey Monkey tool, and I didn't get very many responses, and it was a little bit disappointing. But I think that as we have this, our group, has this vast knowledge base that I'm asking several questions of the group that they're just not knowledgeable yet enough of the opportunities that they could have in terms of other models. My particular group in this community, the groups I've been working with thus far, are very attached to staying in their homes. They feel, based on the existing, what is existing available right now, that's their best option to age in place in their home. And I am trying to show them that possibly that doesn't deal with, in the future, isolation and what Dr. Thomas refers to as the 3 plagues of aging, which is isolation, boredom, and helplessness.
Yeah.
And unless you have a strong family support system, or as you mentioned, Phoebe, some families can live multi-generational in their homes and they have family that's local, but in our culture, oftentimes the nuclear family is spread across many states or even countries, and your children don't live near you. So I'm trying to sort of encourage them to think forward, and when they require a deeper level of care, there's a couple issues that are come to play in that, in terms of nursing and staffing and being able to provide aging in place services within the home, as well as the issues of isolation, boredom, and helplessness. And I also think of it, an issue that's come to mind recently, is how the issue of aging in place affects the caregivers, even if they are family. Oftentimes caregivers are women, how that affects their role in the workforce, when you do have to care for an aging parent. So again, I think that points in the direction of these intergenerational models in which we have a younger and an elder population working and serving each other. It really helps the whole community, and it helps many of our cultural issues that we have been dealing with. Women have been more recently challenged by the pandemic, in which they've had to give up careers or positions so that they could assist with child homeschooling. And I just believe the intergenerational models really support many cultural issues and try to solve many of those cultural issues that we have.
A great way to choose your family so that you can support one
Mhm.
another. Well, this is all the time we have today. This has been an incredibly content-rich webinar. Thank each and every one of you for joining us and participating in it. I do want to remind everybody that all of our webinars do reside on our website, agelesslivingcollaborative.org, and you will be able to look at this and look at the chats and check resources. We will be back next month. We're going to be discussing seniors who choose to live on cruise ships. So that's all we're going to tease you with, but that should be very interesting. That is an entirely different community. So we are not only talking about independent living, assisted living, and memory care. We are talking about all communities that seniors may choose to live in. And so this is a rather unique one. And if you want any more information on intergenerational or multi-generational communities, you can reach out to us in an email at agelesslivingcollaborative.org. We will funnel your questions onto our panelists so that they can address those questions. Thanks so much for joining us. And Christine, Jane, and Linda, thank you for being on the panel today. We really appreciate it. It's been quite informative.
Thank you.
Thanks, Phoebe.
Thank you.
Thank you.